Welcome, wanderer of stars and seeker of forgotten truths. Tonight, we journey deep into the shadows that even the brightest lights of the galaxy dared not touch. Before you drift into slumber, allow this tale to unfold like a whispered legend, carried across the cold winds of space. If the story calls to you, I invite you to follow its thread by leaving your mark and joining the circle of those who listen beyond the veil. Long before the Empire rose, long before the Skywalker name echoed across the stars, there was a secret, a silent fear buried within the heart of the most powerful man in the galaxy. Emperor Palpatine, known as Darth Sidious, Sith Lord of ancient cunning and limitless ambition, harbored a fear so profound that he dared not speak it aloud. It was not fear of armies or rebellions or even death itself. It was fear of a single boy. They called him the Chosen One, born not of man and woman but seemingly conjured by the will of the Force itself. His name was Anakin Skywalker, a boy with golden eyes and a storm within him. Palpatine watched him rise, guided him, shaped him, and claimed him as his dark apprentice. But hidden in the silence of his private chambers, in whispers never recorded, and memories wiped from existence, the Sith Lord trembled, not at what Anakin was, but at what he might become. There are fragments, a recording never meant to be heard, an ancient Sith mural half buried in the sands of Moraband, showing a figure cloaked in fire standing atop the ruins of both Jedi and Sith. There are stories of a vision, seen once and never again, in which Palpatine stood on his knees before a burning star, begging not for his life, but for the end to pass him by. But the holocron containing that vision was lost, stolen on the eve of the Clone Wars, and the one who stole it was never seen again. Until now, let the truth begin. The journey led the chronicler to a world the maps had long forgotten. A dead moon adrift in the mid-rim, where no ships travelled and no stars sang. It was once called Vuren, a place the Jedi touched briefly during the High Republic, but abandoned when the Force there turned quiet. Now its surface lay cracked, its crust buried in ash, and beneath the weight of countless years, it whispered secrets to those willing to listen. The ship descended through pale clouds, drawn by instinct more than navigation. Crystalline spires rose from the landscape like broken blades, and beneath them, scattered among the frost, lay remnants of temples carved in the old language. The chronicler stepped out onto ground that crunched beneath his boots, his senses reaching for the rhythm of the Force. There was no light here, no guidance, only memory and silence. He wandered into the temple's ruins, guided by the feeling that something once great had died here. The walls were lined with carvings, faded and half erased, but one image had survived time's erosion. A figure, not clothed in Jedi robes nor draped in Sith armor. He stood at the center of a swirling storm, hands outstretched as thousands knelt in reverence or fear. Above his head, etched in deep cuts, was the same symbol the chronicler had found beneath the Jedi temple. Dissolution, the end of structures, the collapse of balance. He lit a small lamp and sat among the rubble, opening the ancient texts he carried. They were fragments of translated Sith codices and Jedi prophecy scrolls. Most of it was myth wrapped in metaphor and riddled with contradictions. But one thread repeated across the centuries, the idea that balance was not peace but reckoning. That true balance could only come after everything had been swept away. Anakin Skywalker had not been the first name given to this force of change. Across cultures, he was called by many things. Flameborn, the Axis, the tear in the veil. None of them spoke of peace. All of them spoke of thresholds, of endings and beginnings. But only one source had ever linked these titles directly to a living being. It came from a recovered vision scroll preserved by a Mirialan seer 1,000 years before Anakin's birth. She had spoken of a boy born of no father, touched by the Force in its rawest state, not channeled through training or doctrine, but direct, unfiltered. A power so pure it could unravel the old ways by its mere presence. They will try to shape him. They will bind him with names and robes, but he will not belong to them. He will walk through their towers and see only cages. The chronicler closed his eyes and let the Force guide him further. The landscape outside blurred with shadow and frost, but the visions remained sharp. He saw a child standing at the edge of a battlefield, untouched by the destruction around him. Soldiers bowed their heads, Jedi hesitated, Sith turned away, and in his silence he judged them all. Anakin had always struggled with the rules. Even as a child he had questioned the Jedi way, not out of defiance but out of something deeper, an instinct that the structures around him were incomplete, that justice and balance could not live. In the same breath, the Jedi taught patience, detachment, serenity. But Anakin felt everything, loved too deeply, feared too greatly, fought too fiercely. They saw these things as flaws. Palpatine saw them as tools. But what if they were neither? What if they were signs? The chronicler remembered something he had read on Ossus, a line buried in the oldest Jedi writings. The one who carries the storm shall not choose sides. He will become the storm. The thought returned to Palpatine, the man who had controlled galactic fate like a puppeteer. Why would such a being, confident and absolute, concern himself with a boy from the outer rim? The answer was no longer buried in mystery. It was now emerging from beneath centuries of blindness, because Palpatine saw something the others did not. He saw what lay beyond titles and prophecies. He saw that Anakin was not simply a weapon or a servant. He was an echo of the Force unbound, and no matter how tightly one tried to control such a being, its true nature would always slip free. The chronicler stood once more and gazed across the frozen wastes. He felt the shifting currents beneath his feet. This journey was not about understanding what Anakin had become. It was about realizing what he had been from the beginning. Not a Jedi, not a Sith, but something far older and far more dangerous. The stars had shifted again, not visibly, not to the common eye, but deep within the patterns of the Force. Something was moving. The chronicler left the frozen echoes of Vurin behind, guided now not only by instinct, but by something older. A presence, faint but persistent, pulling him toward a place that had once been sacred and now lay in shadow. The world was called Lord, once a hub of philosophy and deep Force study, now silent, its surface scarred by ancient wars and more recent silence. It was here that the chronicler sought the last fragments of a Jedi archive wiped clean at the end of the Clone Wars. The city ruins crumbled beneath time, but beneath the rubble of a collapsed university, he found a hidden chamber, untouched by fire or blaster. Dust clung to rows of data books and faded scrolls, and at the center stood a viewing pedestal, inactive but intact. With careful hands he coaxed it to life, and what bloomed from the light was not a battle record or council transcript, but a meditation journal, not of a master, of a learner. The voice that spoke was young, quiet, filled with doubt. They say, I am the chosen one, that I was born to bring balance, but they never tell me what that means. What if balance is not peace? What if it is fire? The chronicler leaned in. The entry bore no name, but the signature of the force within the words was unmistakable. This was Anakin himself, young, conflicted, unaware of what he would become. The rest of the journal was fragmented, corrupted, but enough remained to paint. A picture not of a destined hero, but of a boy trapped between paths not of his choosing. They watch me like I'm a solution, but I don't feel like one. I feel like a question they're afraid to ask. The chronicler closed the journal and stepped outside, feeling the weight of those words settle in the pit of his soul. Anakin had not moved forward with certainty. He had been cast into a world of symbols and prophecy, and everyone around him had chosen to see only what they needed to see. But the Force had not spoken in absolutes. It had whispered in riddles, and Anakin had been left to interpret those whispers alone. From Lord, the trail turned inward, not toward places, but toward minds. The chronicler sought out the last remaining witnesses of Anakin's early days, not generals, not politicians, but those who had stood beside him when he was still a boy, lost in the halls of the Jedi Temple. He found one such voice on a drifting medical frigate repurposed into a monastic refuge. A woman, once a Jedi healer, now silent and aged, gave him only a single sentence before retreating into solitude. We saw the fire and we told ourselves it was light. Her words struck like cold iron. The Jedi had mistaken power for promise. The Sith had mistaken passion for control. No one had truly seen him, and what of Palpatine? The man who watched Anakin's growth more closely than anyone, the one who whispered into his doubts and soothed his fears with poisoned wisdom, the chronicler began to see the pattern. Palpatine had not merely discovered Anakin. He had been waiting for him. Old records told of Darth Plagueis, a Sith obsessed with manipulating life through the Force. Whispers claimed he sought to create the perfect vessel, a being born of the Force itself. But what if such a being had already been conceived, not by Sith ritual, but by the Force as a reaction, a response to the growing imbalance, a being not created to serve, but to correct? If Anakin was that being, then Palpatine's interest was no longer curiosity. It was fear disguised as guidance. The chronicler pieced together the unspoken moments, Palpatine watching Anakin's victories with quiet intensity, steering him toward war, not to forge him, but to confine him, pushing him toward loss, not to break him, but to prevent awakening. Anakin Skywalker was not feared for what he might do. He was feared for what he might realize. For if he ever truly understood the depth of his connection to the Force, he would become something no Sith could control and no Jedi could predict. He would become the balance itself. And balance does not negotiate. Balance does not follow orders. It simply acts. The stars above Lord began to shift again, subtle but certain. The chronicler knew now that his search was no longer about uncovering a buried past. It was about following the tremors of a truth that refused to be silenced. Somewhere out there, across the starlit void, the echoes of what Anakin could have been still lingered, waiting, watching, and perhaps in the right moment, ready to be heard again. The journey led next to the moon world of Obadiah, home to the Pike Syndicate and buried secrets. Its surface was thick with clouds and trade fog, but beneath the criminal layers of spice and shadow lay vaults older than the syndicate itself. The chronicler followed a forgotten star chart etched into a Jedi starfighter fragment, its path aligned with ancient constellations no longer visible from the core. The trail ended at a temple ruin swallowed by jungle and time. The force was heavy here, not dark, not light, but dense, as if it held its breath. The chronicler entered the structure with careful reverence. Faded carvings lined the interior, many in scripts unrecognized by any current galactic language. But amidst the forgotten tongues, one symbol returned again and again, a split circle surrounded by flame. He had seen it before, in the statue, beneath the temple on Coruscant, in the dreams whispered across Jeddah. And now here, scrawled across the walls like a warning or perhaps a promise. In the center chamber, he found what he had been unknowingly seeking, a holocron fractured along one edge but still active. The light that spilled from it shimmered faintly, and a voice emerged, a voice he recognized instantly, calm, cold, certain. It was Palpatine. The transmission was unlisted in any archive, buried, forgotten on purpose. Perhaps even by the Sith themselves. In it, the Chancellor spoke not as ruler, not as manipulator, but as a man speaking to himself in the shadows. He is not as the others were. I have seen the line of Skywalker through the veil of time. It is not a lineage. It is a force, a fracture sent by the cosmos. He was not born for my use. He was born to end me. The voice paused. Even recorded, even alone, Palpatine hesitated. I moved too quickly. I taught him to fight before he could think. I gave him victories before he knew loss, not to lift him, to weaken him, because if he ever understands what he is, if he ever reaches beyond the cage I have built around him, he will become something. I cannot command. The recording ended there, the final seconds corrupted or perhaps erased. The chronicler stared into the dim light of the holocron, understanding now what had always remained just outside the reach of Jedi and Sith alike. Anakin Skywalker had never been truly free. His choices were narrowed, his path forged not by fate, but by fear. The fear of others, the fear of what he could become if left unshaped. The chronicler searched further through the ruins, his hand brushing across stone panels and shattered crystal. He found a mural behind the collapsed wall, revealed only when the light hit the surface at a precise angle. It showed a figure standing at the center of two opposing armies, one side clad in Jedi robes, the other in blackened Sith armor. Both sides were falling. Around the central figure, flames rose, but his expression was calm. Not angry, not proud, just still. This was not a warrior, this was not a conqueror, this was an end. He traced the figure's outline and felt the force hum softly in the stone. Not with aggression. With inevitability, the final clue came in a chamber, deeper still, buried beneath layers of time and silence. There he found fragments of a Jedi artifact, one that recorded visions of the future. Most were shattered. But one crystal memory remained. A flash of Anakin, older, cloaked in Jedi robes, but eyes burning with something not yet fallen. Before the mask, before the title. He stood alone on a high precipice, staring at twin moons. Behind him, the Order debated, voices raised in confusion and pride. Ahead of him, shadow waited, not threatening, but inviting. In that moment, the vision paused, and in the pause, The chronicler felt it clearly. Anakin had always known, not everything, not the details, but he had always sensed the weight pressing around him, expectations cloaked as prophecy, teachings shaped as rules, whispers that claimed to guide him, but truly only sought to control what could not be controlled. And still he walked forward, not into darkness, not into light, into something else, into himself. The desert world of Arcanis was a place few visited, and fewer remembered. It had once served as a military outpost during the Old Republic, and later as an early training ground for the officers of the Empire. But deeper than its bunkers and citadels, far beneath the shattered towers of forgotten wars, there was a chamber untouched by time. The chronicler arrived at dusk, following the path marked only by the fading language of a Force sect long extinguished. The air was dry, the wind silent. The past waited. Beneath the sand-laden floor, sealed behind a coded door of stone and alloy, he discovered a repository of Jedi scrolls and separatist transmissions archived together. A contradiction. Allies and enemies preserved in the same vault. But it was in that contradiction that the truth began to flicker. The Jedi archives spoke often of Anakin as a gifted knight, strong in battle, reckless in youth, destined for greatness. Yet, scattered among those texts were remarks from masters who had never spoken publicly. Concerns not about his power, but about how it responded to the world. One wrote that Anakin's strength was not summoned, it reacted. That when he reached out through the Force moved with him too quickly, too easily, as if it were not simply listening, but waiting for him. The separatist recordings told a different story. They mentioned a warrior who tore through entire battalions without fear or hesitation. One report described a battle where Anakin had fought alone for hours, surrounded, outnumbered, never retreating. Not for strategy, not for valor, but because he could not stop. It was as if something deeper had taken over, something not fully under his control. At first, the chronicler believed this to be evidence of Anakin's descent, the first signs of the darkness that would one day become Darth Vader. But as he followed the timeline, as he pieced together the emotion behind the action, a different shape began to emerge. Anakin had not fallen, not yet. He had fought because the Force poured through him in a flood, and no one had taught him how to hold it back. The Jedi offered discipline, but no release. The Sith offered power, but no peace. Neither had given him the space to understand what he was becoming. And so, the galaxy made its first mistake. It assumed Anakin Skywalker was merely powerful. It did not see that he was changing. The chronicler unearthed a forgotten transmission from Obi-Wan Kenobi, dated near the middle of the Clone Wars. It had never reached the Jedi Council, intercepted perhaps, or buried on purpose. In it, Obi-Wan's voice held a tension unlike anything he had spoken before. He is not the same. He questions the Force now, not with doubt, but with hunger. He feels things I cannot sense. He hears truths I am not ready to hear. I fear we have taught him too little, too late. It was the kind of confession a brother makes in the quiet when love turns to worry. But then came the contradiction. The temple's official log from that same week recorded Anakin as focused, loyal, an example to the Padawans who followed him into war. The same man seen two ways, praised by the structure, feared by the individual. That fracture widened as the war continued. Some believed Anakin was the Republic's greatest weapon. Others whispered that he was its final warning, and at the heart of all those reflections stood Palpatine. The chronicler began to understand that the Sith Lord had not created the darkness in Anakin. He had simply waited for the galaxy to misread him, to push him too far, to corner him in a world that misunderstood his every breath. The war was never just about planets or politics. It was a crucible designed not to forge Anakin into a Sith, but to prevent him from becoming something else. Something more. A question rose like fire through the mind of the chronicler. What if Anakin had never joined the Jedi? What if he had walked another path? Would he have burned brighter than both orders combined? Or would the galaxy have crumbled faster under the weight of his truth? He wandered through the final chambers of the archive, where the walls bore carvings from those who had studied Anakin from afar. Outsiders, observers, a mystic from Bardotta, a warrior priest from Dathomir, a scholar from Sereno, none of them Jedi, none of them Sith. And yet each spoke of him not as a chosen one, but as a force not yet realized, a being who bridged the gap between the known and the infinite, one final. Entry struck like a whispered revelation. It was written not in fear, but in wonder. He is not the flame. He is the air that feeds it. The chronicler left Arcanis with more answers than he expected, and yet deeper uncertainty. The truth was forming, but it was not yet whole. Anakin had not been shaped by prophecy. He had been shaped by pressure, by expectation, by fear, and in that pressure something had cracked. Not in him. In the galaxy, the outer rim was vast, scattered, with forgotten systems and hollowed worlds where ancient powers once stirred. The chronicler now followed whispers that no record kept, rumors passed only from voice to voice, stories too dangerous to inscribe. His journey led him to Vyun, a world where the skies always wept and the ground was poisoned by sorrow. Long ago this place had been ruled by the House of Malro, consumed by madness and death, but deeper still in caverns below the manor, ruins, something far older than any noble family remained. The air was heavy with memory. The force hung dense like mist, pressing against the skin. In the darkness of the cavern, the chronicler found walls carved with visions, neither Jedi nor Sith in design. They depicted figures not of good or evil, but of collapse. Not destruction as punishment, but as necessary cleansing. Entire civilizations shone burning beneath the hand of a single luminous figure. The stars around him were not distant. They circled him, as if drawn to a central gravity none could escape. As the chronicler stepped deeper, the visions grew clearer. They were not just stories, they were warnings, echoes from a time when the Force had spoken more directly to those who listened. One image repeated across the stone, a being made of light and shadow, holding no weapon, wearing no crown. Its eyes closed, its hands open, as lightning and fire erupted from the world around it. He understood now. These were not prophecies of a destroyer, they were records of a correction. When imbalance reached a tipping point, the Force did not send a warrior. It sent a catalyst. Anakin was not raised to be that. He was found and shaped by hands too afraid of what he truly was. But the Force had not forgotten. It had placed him in the center of the war, not as a test, but as a fulcrum. The weight of both Jedi restraint and Sith hunger pressed down on him, and slowly, silently, he bent. In the archives of Camino, the chronicler found further threads. Hidden beneath genetic data and erased orders, there were references to an unnamed subject once observed by the cloners, a presence detected but never fully understood. They had called it the anomaly. They believed it to be a malfunction in their instruments, a wave in the force that passed through their facilities without warning. Only one entry dared name the possibility. The anomaly was drawn to a boy brought to Camino under special escort during the earliest days of the war. A Jedi Knight, human, barely more than 20. They never saw his face again. From Camino to Malachor, the chronicler continued. He walked through ruins where the ancient Sith had once performed rituals so dangerous. Their temples were sealed in glass and silence. On the lowest level of the citadel, he found a carving of a figure cloaked in fire. The name etched below was not Anakin. It was older, perhaps a name used in times before recorded speech. But the face matched, the eyes matched, and the shape of the energy that still clung to the place told the truth. The Sith had foreseen someone who could unravel them, not in battle, but by making them irrelevant. The chronicler sat within that ruin for hours, letting the weight of it settle. He no longer questioned why Palpatine had feared the boy. It was no longer a mystery. The Sith had spent generations preparing for the Jedi, but they had not prepared for something beyond either path. The boy was not meant to take sides. He was meant to end the need for sides. A soft wind stirred in the darkness, though no air should have moved in that buried tomb. The chronicler closed his eyes and listened. He did not hear voices. He heard silence forming shape. And in that silence, he understood. Anakin Skywalker had never been the point of conflict. He had been the measure of it. The galaxy was not afraid of his fall, it was afraid of his awakening. The stars above Dantooine shimmered faintly through the early dusk, their light casting long shadows over the crumbled stone of ancient Jedi structures. The chronicler arrived quietly, guided now less by maps and more by intuition. The Force had become a constant companion, not loud but present, like a distant tide always pulling at the edges of thought. Beneath one of the oldest outposts of the Order, he uncovered a sealed chamber, its entrance half buried beneath moss and years of wind-swept silence. Inside, the air felt older than the room itself. It was here that he found something that changed everything. A collection of holocrons, left not by masters, but by initiates. Young Jedi learners, many of whom had served during the early years of the Clone Wars. Their voices were raw, uncertain, untouched by the polish of council chambers or battlefield glory. And again, one name returned, Anakin, but not spoken in reverence, in awe. They spoke of a presence like standing beside a storm barely held back. They spoke of watching him train alone, his movements faster than reason, his connection to the Force so immediate that even the masters sometimes turned away. One voice trembled as it described a moment in meditation when Anakin entered the chamber and the temperature dropped, the silence deepened, and the light flickered. He was still, he was kind, but the Force around him felt like it was waiting for him to speak, as if it had questions only he could answer. The chronicler stepped out into the open air, letting the wind wash over him. He had seen records, texts, prophecies, but this was different. These were the observations of those who had no agenda, no power to protect. They had simply seen him, not as a Jedi, not as a warrior, but as something that did not quite belong. He travelled next to the outer rim of Dagobah, not to seek Master Yoda's shadow, but to follow a vision that had begun in sleep and sharpened each day. There, within the living swamp, wrapped in roots and the slow pulse of the planet, he felt something shift. He did not find structures or relics, he found clarity. The Force did not speak in words, it spoke in alignment, and what it showed him was this. Palpatine had not just feared Anakin because he could destroy him. He feared him because he could unmake the very concept of the Sith and the Jedi. He feared that Anakin, if allowed to truly evolve, would render both orders meaningless, that his choices would not lead to balance through control, but balance through transcendence. The chronicler saw now what few had dared to believe. Anakin was not meant to fall. He was meant to rise beyond both traditions, carrying with him the memory of what had failed, and that was why he was broken. Not by the dark side, not by war, but by those who could not imagine a world without the walls they had built, Jedi, Sith. Each had tried to write his story before he could live it, and in doing so, they wrote their own ending. The chronicler sat beneath the branches of a sleeping tree, the air filled with the hum of distant creatures and unseen life. He let the silence return. And in that silence, a memory came, not his own, but one carried by the Force itself. A child standing before the Jedi Council, a boy too young to speak their language, too old to be taught without fear. And yet behind his eyes, the Force pulsed like a second heartbeat. He did not ask to be chosen. He had already been chosen by something far older. The chronicler opened his journal for the first time in weeks and wrote only a single line. He was never meant to be a part of the story. He was meant to end it. The stars over Moraband were cold and silent. Once the capital of the Sith, the planet now lay barren, its surface cracked by ancient wars and the unending hunger of time. Few dared walk its surface, fewer still descended into the tombs buried beneath its scorched skin. But the chronicler did, for in the shadows of the past he had begun to see the outlines of something far greater than prophecy or fear. He had begun to see the shape of a truth so carefully hidden it had almost vanished completely. Deep below the surface, beneath the layers of bone dust and silence, he entered the tomb of Ajunta Pal. The walls pulsed faintly with residual energy, the kind that lingered from centuries of obsession and madness. At the far end of the chamber, he discovered a vault sealed by bloodline, bound by a name spoken only in silence. Skywalker. The door opened not by key or code, but by resonance. The Force itself recognized the one who sought not to control, but to understand. Inside the vault was no treasure, no weapon, only fragments of broken holocrons and the echoes of voices lost to time. The chronicler sat cross-legged on the cold stone, allowing the Force to draw him into the memory stored within the fractured crystal. A vision bloomed. It showed the past, but not as recorded by Jedi or Sith. It showed corridors of light and shadow entwined, and through them walked a figure cloaked in neither. Anakin stood at the center of both orders, and yet belonged to neither. He moved as if aware of eyes unseen, his expression neither angry nor afraid, but burdened. He was not lost. He was waiting. Waiting for the moment to choose a path neither side had prepared. The scene shifted. A gathering of Sith Lords in a darkened chamber, speaking not of power, but of endings. One of them, ancient and weary, warned of a coming breach in the current of the Force. A being born not to uphold the Sith or the Jedi, but to erase the need for them. A convergence point. a will of the Force made flesh. We must either bind him before he sees, or the galaxy will forget our names. Then silence. The vision faded, leaving only the stillness of the tomb. The chronicler's breath returned slowly. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of what he had seen. The Sith knew, long before Anakin was born, they had seen him, or something like him. A being that did not hunger for power, but whose presence alone would bring change, not through violence, through inevitability. A force that could not be taught or ruled. The Jedi knew as well, perhaps not in words, but in the way they confined him, in the way they insisted he obey, not because of danger, but because of uncertainty. They did not fear his power. They feared what it might reveal about theirs. And Palpatine, the architect of lies, the master of manipulation, he had been the only one who tried to stop it with action, not through wisdom or counsel, but by breaking the boy before the truth could ever bloom. The chronicler rose from the tomb, his mind still wrapped in the echo of what he had learned. He no longer walked as a seeker. Now he carried a burden of clarity. The galaxy had not been divided by light and dark. It had been divided by fear, the fear of losing control, the fear of what would come if someone truly free ever stepped into the center of the Force and saw it for what it was. And Anakin had stood on that edge. More than once, he had almost seen it, almost reached it, but each time someone pulled him back. A master, a council, a chancellor, a war. Each time the truth slipped just beyond his grasp, and when he fell, it was not because he was consumed. It was because the galaxy could not survive what he might become if he did not. Now the chronicler stood beneath the stars of Moraband, the ancient light of forgotten suns, casting long shadows behind him. The silence around him no longer felt empty. It felt filled with things never said, choices never made, paths never taken. He gazed upward, not toward the stars, but toward the space between them, for that was where Anakin had always stood. Not as light, not as dark as the space between. The journey led next to a quiet moon above Megiddo, where crystalline winds howled through canyons of frozen light. Few had ever come here without war trailing behind them, but now there was only stillness. The chronicler had followed the final coordinates from an erased Jedi record, one that had vanished shortly after Order 66. There, tucked into the cliffs, was a monastery long lost to history. Its walls were carved not for defense, but reflection. Its halls echoed with the footsteps of those who had once searched for truth outside the lines of doctrine. The monks who remained were not Jedi nor Sith. They were scholars of the Force, silent witnesses to both its peace and violence. They had no loyalty to temples or empires, only to understanding. When the chronicler spoke of Anakin Skywalker, they did not ask why. They simply opened their archives. Inside their vault, the air was thick with memory. Stacks of preserved scrolls and recovered transmissions lined the stone. The chronicler sat among them for days, piecing together fragments of old journals, forgotten visions, and whispered warnings. And across them all, the same pattern began to emerge. A great figure would rise in the age of war, born of no legacy, tied to no master. He would walk both paths, feel both fires, and be claimed by neither. He would be loved by the Order, but never fully trusted, hated by the enemy, yet never truly known, a fulcrum around which all else would turn. Some named him the Flame Walker, others the Stormbound. But always, always, his story ended not in triumph, but in interruption. One vision, preserved in a meditation crystal recovered from Bardotta, showed a circle of masters seated in quiet judgment. Before them stood a boy, his presence so strong it distorted the air. They spoke of balance, of order, of peace. He said nothing. He simply looked toward the stars where something greater waited beyond them. And then the vision cracked, not from darkness, from resistance, as if the Force itself rejected the ending being written. The monks offered the chronicler a final text, an oral history passed down for generations, never written until that day. It spoke of a time to come when the Force would no longer bend to the wills of those who claimed to serve it, when the Force would find its own voice, and that voice would not speak in absolutes. It would be human, imperfect, passionate. It would love, it would grieve, it would burn. They believed Anakin was that voice, not because he was flawless, but because he was true. The chronicler listened to their words and felt something shift within him. His search had begun in mystery. It had moved through shadows and revelations, power and fear. But now, in this monastery carved from stillness, he felt something new. Not clarity, not certainty. Peace. He realized that Anakin had never been lost. He had been silenced by voices too frightened to let him speak for himself, by systems that saw his depth as danger, by a galaxy so afraid of change that it shattered the one who might have carried it forward. In that silence, the chronicler looked back on every record, every vision, every memory of Anakin Skywalker, not as the man who became Vader, not as the boy who left Tatooine, but as something else entirely. A mirror the galaxy could not bear to face. And still the Force had not abandoned him. Even at the height of his fall, even beneath the weight of his sins, the Force had remained with him, watching, waiting, not to punish, but to offer one final choice. For balance does not mean victory, it means return. The chronicler left the monastery in the soft light of early dawn. The sky above Maijito shimmered with pale blue crystal clouds. He walked slowly, not out of fatigue, but reflection. His search had not ended, but now he finally understood what he was searching for. He was not chasing a secret. He was listening for a voice the galaxy had once drowned, and now at last it was beginning to rise again. The final path led the chronicler to Mustafar. The world burned beneath blackened skies, its rivers of molten fire casting light across the shattered surface. Long ago, this place had been a sanctuary of the Sith, a crucible of pain and fury, and it was here, on this cursed world, that Anakin Skywalker had vanished and Darth Vader had been born. Yet the chronicler did not come to find ashes. He came to find what remained beneath them. He moved beyond the broken fortress, through canyons carved by lava and time, until he reached a ridge untouched by structures or war. There, half buried in stone, was a pillar marked by ancient runes. Not Sith, not Jedi, symbols older than either, carved by those who understood the Force not as a tool, but as an ocean. Beneath that pillar was a chamber sealed by silence. Inside, there were no relics, only light, a white void still and endless, held together by threads of memory suspended in the Force. The chronicler stepped forward, and the chamber responded. Visions surged around him, drawn from the past, the future, and something else beyond both. He saw Anakin standing at the edge of a burning field, his robes torn, his face marked by fire and sorrow. not yet Vader, not yet fallen. Around him, the Force was alive with tension. Jedi voices echoed behind him, Sith promises shimmered ahead. But Anakin looked neither way. His gaze was lifted to the sky, where nothing waited but silence. Then came another image, Palpatine watching from a distant tower, cloaked in shadow, his eyes filled not with triumph, but with dread. He spoke to no one. He simply stared into the storm of Anakin's presence, as if seeing not a student, not a servant, but an end. He knew. He had known from the beginning. Not because of prophecy, not because of the Force, but because Palpatine, more than anyone, understood the cost of change. He saw that Anakin could not be controlled, that if left to grow, Anakin would not merely shift the balance, he would end the game altogether. Palpatine had acted not out of strength, but desperation. He had twisted the boy's destiny because he feared the truth, that the galaxy did not belong to the Sith, that it did not belong to the Jedi, that it never had. It belonged to something deeper, to the ones born in between, to the ones who questioned, to the ones who burned. The visions blurred again. A final image emerged. Anakin on the Death Star, older now, colder, buried beneath the mask and armor. Yet in his final moments he looked at his son. And in that gaze there was no hatred, no fear, only recognition, not of Luke, but of himself, of the path he had once glimpsed and lost. And for a moment he stepped back into that truth, not as Darth Vader, not as the Chosen One, but as the boy who had once asked what balance truly meant. The vision faded, the light dimmed, and the chamber fell silent. The chronicler stepped out onto the ridge once more. The sky above Mustafar remained heavy with smoke, but within the Force something had shifted. Not broken, not healed, but realigned. The monks offered the chronicler a final text, an oral history passed down for generations, never written until that day. It spoke of a time to come when the Force would no longer bend to the wills of those who claimed to serve it, when the Force would find its own voice. And that voice would not speak in absolutes. It would be human, imperfect, passionate. It would love. It would grieve. It would burn. They believed Anakin was that voice. Not because he was flawless, but because he was true. The chronicler listened to their words and felt something shift within him. His search had begun in mystery. It had moved through shadows and revelations, power and fear. But now, in this monastery carved from stillness, he felt something new. Not clarity, not certainty. Peace. He realized that Anakin had never been lost. He had been silenced by voices too frightened to let him speak for himself, by systems that saw his depth as danger, by a galaxy so afraid of change that it shattered the one who might have carried it forward. In that silence, the chronicler looked back on every record, every vision, every memory of Anakin Skywalker. Not as the man who became Vader, not as the boy who left Tatooine, but as something else entirely. A mirror the galaxy could not bear to face, and still the Force had not abandoned him. Even at the height of his fall, even beneath the weight of his sins, the Force had remained with him, watching, waiting, not to punish, but to offer one final choice. For balance does not mean victory, it means return. The chronicler left the monastery in the soft light of early dawn. The sky above Megiddo shimmered with pale blue crystal clouds. He walked slowly, not out of fatigue, but reflection. His search had not ended, but now he finally understood what he was searching for. He was not chasing a secret. He was listening for a voice the galaxy had once drowned, and now at last it was beginning to rise again. The final path led the chronicler to Mustafar. The world burned beneath blackened skies, its rivers of molten fire casting light across the shattered surface. Long ago, this place had been a sanctuary of the Sith, a crucible of pain and fury. And it was here, on this cursed world, that Anakin Skywalker had vanished and Darth Vader had been born. Yet the chronicler did not come to find ashes. He came to find what remained beneath them. He moved beyond the broken fortress, through canyons carved by lava and time, until he reached a ridge untouched by structures or war. There, half buried in stone, was a pillar marked by ancient runes. Not Sith, not Jedi, symbols older than either, carved by those who understood the Force not as a tool, but as an ocean. Beneath that pillar was a chamber sealed by silence. Inside, there were no relics, only light. A white void, still and endless, held together by threads of memory suspended in the Force. The chronicler stepped forward, and the chamber responded. Visions surged around him, drawn from the past, the future, and something else beyond both. He saw Anakin standing at the edge of a burning field, his robes torn, his face marked by fire and sorrow. Not yet Vader, not yet fallen. Around him, the Force was alive with tension. Jedi voices echoed behind him, Sith promises shimmered ahead. But Anakin looked neither way. His gaze was lifted to the sky, where nothing waited but silence. Then came another image, Palpatine watching from a distant tower, cloaked in shadow, his eyes filled not with triumph, but with dread. He spoke to no one. He simply stared into the storm of Anakin's presence, as if seeing not a student, not a servant, but an end. He knew. He had known from the beginning. Not because of prophecy, not because of the Force, but because Palpatine, more than anyone, understood the cost of change. He saw that Anakin could not be controlled, that if left to grow, Anakin would not merely shift the balance, he would end the game altogether. Palpatine had acted not out of strength, but desperation. He had twisted the boy's destiny because he feared the truth, that the galaxy did not belong to the Sith, that it did not belong to the Jedi, that it never had. It belonged to something deeper, to the ones born in between, to the ones who questioned, to the ones who burned. The visions blurred again. A final image emerged. Anakin on the Death Star, older now, colder, buried beneath the mask and armor. Yet in his final moments he looked at his son, and in that gaze there was no hatred, no fear, only recognition, not of Luke, but of himself, of the path he had once glimpsed and lost. And for a moment he stepped back into that truth, not as Darth Vader, not as the Chosen One, but as the boy who had once asked what balance truly meant. The vision faded, the light dimmed, and the chamber fell silent. The chronicler stepped out onto the ridge once more. The sky above Mustafar remained heavy with smoke, but within the Force, something had shifted. Not broken, not healed, but realigned. The wind on Polis Massa was thin and still. The world was a drifting fragment of stone, lifeless except for the small medical station hidden in its core. It was here that Padme Amidala had drawn her final breath. And it was here, in the quiet, that followed the collapse of an era, that Anakin's last ties to who he had been were broken. But the chronicler had not come to mourn her. He had come because there was something left behind, something unseen. The station had been decommissioned long ago, but within its ruins, sealed behind medical records and encrypted transmissions, the chronicler uncovered a file never meant to be opened. A record of brainwave patterns taken during Padmé's final hours. The machines had tried to explain her death as physical, but there had been no wounds, no poison, no illness. The patterns told a different story. She had died of heartbreak, but not simply grief. Something had been taken from her, something vital, beyond flesh and bone, as if a part of her had been severed in the Force itself. And in that moment the chronicler saw it clearly. Anakin had not only fallen, he had been erased. Piece by piece, stripped away until only the mask remained. Not by the dark side alone, not by Palpatine's will, but by the galaxy's refusal to allow him to be whole. The Jedi had demanded restraint. The Sith had demanded surrender. No one had ever allowed him to simply exist. And when that last anchor was gone, when the only person who had seen him as human was lost, he stopped fighting. Not because he was weak, but because the pain of being misunderstood had become greater than the pain of obedience. The chronicler walked through the barren corridors, each footstep echoing with absence. He understood now why the Force had led him here. This was not just the place where a life ended. It was the place where silence won, but only for a time. For in that silence, something else had been born. A shadow, yes, but not the kind the Sith had hoped for. Vader had carried power, but not purpose. He had been a cage with no key. And yet, even in that prison, something of Anakin endured. The Force had not abandoned him. It had waited, it had watched, and when the time came, when the Son stood before the Father, when the galaxy held its breath once more, the truth returned. Not in triumph, in mercy. In a single act of defiance, Anakin had shattered the design of those who had used him. He had turned on the one who feared him most. And in doing so, he broke the cycle that had bound them all. Palpatine's fear had not been unfounded. He had seen this moment. He had tried to prevent it, but destiny is not a chain. It is a door, and Anakin, at last, had chosen to walk through it. The chronicler stood at the edge of the station, staring into the black ocean of stars. He thought of all the voices that had tried to define Skywalker, master, knight, betrayer, monster, savior. None of them had seen what he had seen. A boy born from mystery, a man shaped by conflict, a soul trapped between truths too ancient to name, but in the end he had not been destroyed. He had remembered, and in remembering he had returned. The stars drifted gently across the void, their light soft and ancient, far beyond the reach of warships and councils, beyond the maps that marked territory and power. The galaxy moved in quiet rhythm. Planets turned, suns breathed, dust curled through the empty spaces like forgotten thoughts. And in that stillness, the Force spoke once more. The chronicler sat on the deck of his small vessel, its engines silent, its path guided only by instinct. Around him, the quiet hum of space wrapped the world in peace. He had seen the archives, he had heard the lost recordings. He had walked through tombs and temples and broken cities. And now there was nothing more to find. Only something to accept. Anakin. Skywalker had not been a riddle to solve. He had been a mirror, a reflection of everything the galaxy feared to see in itself. Power without control, passion without permission, love without limit. The Force had not chosen him to fulfill a role. It had offered him a chance to reshape what role even meant. He had failed, and then he had returned, not as a symbol, not as redemption, but as memory made whole. The chronicler looked out at the stars and imagined what might have been. If the boy from Tatooine had been allowed to simply be. If the temple had nurtured his spirit instead of binding it. If the war had not demanded his rage. If love had not been forbidden. If prophecy had not placed a crown upon a child's head before he knew what destiny meant. But the Force does not dream of what might have been. It waits. It watches, and it remembers. In the end, Anakin's greatest act was not the power he wielded or the battles he won. It was the single moment in which he chose compassion over legacy. In the heart of darkness, with the galaxy poised on the edge of annihilation, he remembered who he was, and that memory saved everything.